All right, it's good. So just before I start then, I want to bring your notice to a case that's going on in the Toronto courts at the moment. And because of COVID, they're actually live streaming it. So rather than having to go to Toronto and sit in the court, you can actually see it online. So what this case is to do with, and I talked about it yesterday with the 3230 people, is a few years ago, raw milk was banned. Not only banned for sale, but you couldn't even give it away. And this upset a lot of farmers and the raw milk consortia. There's different parties. They were going to push to try and get raw milk approved again, i.e. the prohibition removed. And there were really heavy backers on this one. And my part of it, I was an expert witness for the government, who obviously want to keep it banned. And it was an interesting case in that obviously raw milk is a dangerous thing to drink, but it comes to a point where you say, well, there's lots of dangerous things in the world, isn't there? Is it freedom of consumer choice? And if you're interested in following the case, and like I say, they don't record it and put it on YouTube, but they do stream it on YouTube. So you can go at 10 o'clock today to a YouTube link and just listen to it. And although you probably won't be able to survive all day with it, I think just actually hearing about half an hour just illustrates where kind of science gets thrown out the window. And it's just legal argument, which was interesting because you've got non-scientists essentially trying to decide on a food safety issue. And it was very interesting, the cross-examination it was over 2 days. They tried to twist everything you can. I enjoyed it though, I must admit, but anyway. That's the sort of thing you do. So yeah, if you're interested, you can just go on stream live and then have a look at it. I found it interesting yesterday, but everyone got different views anyway. Anyway, so stop dawdling about as we usually do. We'll carry on with sanitation. And as I mentioned about sanitation, it is the most important part of a operation of a facility, because we can trace a lot of the outbreaks and defaults to poor sanitation. And hence in the regulation, we have to have a sanitation plan. And as we elaborate on, in the sanitation plan, we look at the key sort of important information, what to do, how to do it in the SSOP. Then we came to monitoring, didn't we? And monitoring goes beyond just microbial counts. Microbial counts are really for verification. Monitoring is, are they doing it correctly? Are they doing it according to the SSOP? We do microbial counts, testing, just like I mentioned before, not to catch contamination. You should never do that, even though people do, but more to do with saying, yes, this plan is working because we're getting low counts. Now, I finished off rather abruptly last time, saying, well, what's the good count? What's the bad count? Oh, you're right. So the reality is they will never give you a number. They won't say, 10 CFU per centimetre square is a good number or a bad number. And the reason why they don't give numbers is because of the various facilities. So facilities vary, the ability to clean them vary. And so what you have to do is it's a guessing game. You've got to come up with your own sort of baseline. And when we say, well, you can call it your baseline, so we'll have 10,000 CFU per centimetre square, that's a question. You've got to base it on some science. So the science that you base it on is either through healthcare, where they're obviously more diligent about sanitation, or you do your own baseline. So this is where you have a sanitation plan and you really diligently do it over 5 days. So you're looking at everything. And then you take microbial swabs and you'll get a number. And as a general rule of thumb, you're looking at less than 100, well, even less than that, less than 100 CFU per centimetre square for a total aerobic cow. And depending on the facility, 0 coliforms, although some facilities are a bit harder than others. But you set yourself a baseline and you go from that baseline. And with all baselines, you want to try and reduce the counts, isn't it? That's the whole point. You're revising it. Now, the frequency of testing is another. They won't tell you what the frequency of testing is. And I think I've said many times, there's this juice company took 36, I think, swabs every morning. You know, that's, God knows how they afforded it. But the frequency of testing really depends on certain things. One is regulation. So the regulation really only applies to listeria because listeria is in the environment and you've got to test for it because it's a bad pathogen. So the only sort of recommendation you'll see in the sort of regulation is that you've got to take 10 samples for listeria every week. But for everything else, you know, total viable count and coliforms, there's no real sort of a guideline on the frequency of testing. So what you've got to decide on is not only how often you test, but what time you test as well. So obviously pre-operational is a good time because it's going to tell you how sanitary the line is. Within processing, it'll tell you how bad things get fairly early on. You know, you basically take a sample and you say, well, maybe we should limit that production run to 24 hours rather than 36 hours because of the accumulation of contamination of the line. And also post-operation, before sanitation is useful because if you want to know how effective your sanitation plan is, you've got to know, well, how much was there to start with. So you sample at those different points. But in terms of the frequency, it's really your decision, and you base it on trend lines. So as we talked about trending, we did this in the last, whatever unit we did it in. We do trending for sanitation environmental samples. So in this case, we've got, say, total viable count, for example, on some contact surfaces. So at which point, or which of these would you say, well, rather than sample once a week, maybe we should start sampling once a day, or things like that? And this is why trend analysis is so powerful. And this is why, Maple Leaf failed to do trend analysis, which is why they got into the position they were in. I'll just wait for a few more. So trend analysis is where we take samples from surfaces, could be conveyors, etc. That's all right. So we'll see what the responses are. Oh, mixed one. So the fact is that you take samples when things are going wrong. Again, you're not relying on to catch contamination, but in this occasion, it's obviously a sample as a rogue sample because the tech could have touched the tip. But these are the increasing ones. So with this one, for example, if you've got this in a sanitation, environmental monitoring, the process is so variable. There's something going on where it's not consistent enough. And funny enough, I'm doing one for a company at the moment, and this is the kind of pattern they have. And you've got to tell them, well, you've got to get more consistent performance. This one's obviously the more worrying one, it's biofilms. And this one is when you change something. So very often when we change a piece of equipment, change a sanitation crew, we get changes. And that's where you would try and sample frequently in order to revise the sanitation plan. You don't just blindly keep sampling. Hopefully it'll go away, isn't it? So typically what you'll have is a testing program, and in a testing program, you would sample along the line and the environment. And what you try to do is identify where areas need to be improved. So as we'll talk about in a little bit, so there's certain parts of the facility that's more critical for sanitation than others. Obviously, the end product towards the end is going to be critical in the cup product. But other things like raw materials, you still need to be diligent about because contamination spreads. So what you'll generally do is get a testing program or testing schedule. And this testing schedule basically samples throughout the line, not at the same frequency. Obviously, as I say, you prioritize the important areas, but you identify which areas need to be improved. And you do things like sanitizer rotation. You might revisit the whole sort of process of disassembling equipment, things like that. Now, we have to prioritize sampling, and we do that by what we call zone testing. So I think this is obvious to everyone, but we'll keep going through it. So the thing with testing, it is expensive. You're talking about $35 for a total aerobic count, about $40, $50 for a E. coli. And so you've got limited budget. Because testing doesn't really bring money in, it's money out, people try to do as little as they can, as always. So we prioritise it by doing zone sampling. So zone 1s are the food contact surface. Zone 2s are the sort of area around the processing line, control box, frames for conveyors. Then zone 3 is the processing environment, where your drains are and things like this. Zone 4, lockers, offices. Zone 5, outside the facility. So with this zoning, what we're doing is that we have to sample at each point over a year. And obviously zone 5s or zone 3s, zone 4s, they're not going to be sampled every week, maybe once a year, things like this. And the reason we do zone sampling is for the simple reason it's all to do with risk, isn't it? The consequence of missing a breakdown in sanitation. So zone 1s, as I mentioned to you, are conveyors, hoppers, anything that touches the product itself. And you can even differentiate two sort of zone 1s. Obviously, the end product, say, for example, post-cook or post-treatment, whatever you want to call it, that's going to be a much sort of increased focus of attention for sampling compared to, say, upstream or downstream, isn't it? Downstream where the raw materials are. But, I know I keep saying it. The reality is that even though you think, well, receiving docks and all that doesn't matter, contamination doesn't stay still. It basically travels through the line. And so you have to sample all of them. But again, with your limited budget, you've got to sample, you've got to use your sampling wisely. And you get more information towards the end product side than you would do the raw material side. So this is a great, we talked about the famous maple leaf slicer. Contacts every piece of product and therefore should be tested. Then you've got zone 2s. Now, zone 2s, as I mentioned, are the frames not directly linked to the food, but could potentially contaminate it, food drips, the condensation and whatnot. Or it could harbour a biofilm, which can then transfer to the zone 1. So we'll talk about frames, railings, and things like this. It's not obvious, isn't it? So here you see we've got bad design here, but they're not contacting the product. But as you can see, potentially they could contaminate the product subsequently. Things like door seals are notorious, accumulate debris, humidity, listeria hotspot, isn't it? And control boxes. And as you probably guess, with control boxes, the last thing you want to do is get them wet. So people tend to literally just not wash them, and they're handled and things like that. So there is a potential source there. Now, zone 3s are, as I said, the sort of processing environment around the line. So these are the drains, the walls, the footbaths, forklift trucks. There was an interesting story. I don't want to digress too much. But there was a listeria outbreak in a ready-to-eat meat facility, and they found listeria, and they couldn't trace it back. And so what they did is they actually went right through the facility and then went to this ingredient supplier. And oddly enough, what happened is they recovered the listeria on the forklift wheels. So what had happened, isn't it, is that the forklift wheels had collected listeria. Somehow it got onto the pallet of product going to this other facility. And once it's in the facility, as I say, listeria just grows. It's just like proliferates. So every single sort of area you've got to keep thinking about. Drains are a good sampling site because they're kind of a collection, and it really highlights the issues people have. So with drains, obviously all the water flows into them, so it collects in there. And it can develop a biofilm and of listeria. And so you sample the drain to see if that's the issue. And also the problem with drains is that when you kind of start cleaning them, the first instinct is just to blast them, isn't it? You get this high pressure hose, that's going to produce aerosols. So closed drains are good because you reduce the backflow. But often what you'll do in industry, you'll see these open drains. And these open drains are good in one respect, because at least you can get to the drain. As you can imagine, produces aerosols, ideal grounds for biofilms. You can see a few biofilms there going on here, I think, isn't it? Yeah, I think that's there. A few biofilms there. Now, zone fours are just the offices, the lockers, and things like that. And you might think, well, what's the point, isn't it? But people do carry contamination onto the line. There was a no, E. coli, was it? I think it was listeria outbreak over in Manitoba, and they recovered the listeria from the sleeve of one of the workers. So again, and the worst one, and I've seen this quite often, is when you go into a facility and they don't ask you, should we say, not let you, ask you to remove your street shoes or boots. I've seen listeria being carried on boots straight, or your shoes straight into a facility. So you don't test this every day. You might test it once a year, but you put it in a schedule. You don't just say, I've got to remember to do zone 4 that time. You've got a timetable of how this is done. And so, as I said to you, testing is expensive, so you have to use it wisely. And so you'll literally draw up a table of the testing schedule. Now, the thing you've got to also remember is that you don't sample the same site continuously, because it's obvious that it could be elsewhere. So what you'll do is you draw a map. So this map is basically squares on zone 1, squares on zone 2 and 3. And you give each square a number. And each time you go sampling, it's like a lottery. You bring the lottery out and say, oh, well, number 5's area today. And the reason we do that is by randomizing, you'll be able to identify issues. If you just do the same sampling point, which I guess is human nature, basically that just tells you about that point. But there is advantages, but usually it has to be random. All right, so listeria is a particular sort of environmental contaminant. And this is why they have a listeria monitoring program. So you've got a sanitation monitoring program, but listeria monitoring program is separate. This is where you're very specific in what you're looking for. Well, specific, but with this one, the reason why listeria is an issue is that it can become established in a processing facility, as we saw in Maple Leaf and Bluebell and all these ones. Really, it's to do with ready-to-eat facilities, because these are products that are going to be slightly cooked, shall we say, or eaten raw. And if you've got listeria in the facility, which most facilities have, if you don't find listeria, you're not looking hard enough. I think that's the old adage, isn't it? And as I know, I keep saying, people think, oh, end product testing, that's the most reliable. It's not. The environmental listeria sampling is much better than end product testing for the simple reason you get a better overview of the sanitary status of your facility. So, as I mentioned to you, in regulation, they actually do state saying, well, you've got to pick 10 sites. Now, those 10 sites, they give you a flexibility of food contact surface or non-food contact surface, zone 1 or other zone 2 or 3. When you get to zone 4s, it gets a bit more ridiculous. But so you've got to have 10 sites, and it really depends on what category of product the category of listeria you are. So if you're in high risk, as in you've got no intervention, listeria can grow in your product, you have to do food contact surface, i.e. 10 on the surface. Now, if you're in a 2A category, and 2A is where the listeria can't grow in the product, or you've had an intervention to reduce listeria, then these can be non-food contact. And you'll see this if you read the listeria code. So the reason why listeria is particularly focused on is because it becomes established, it can grow in facilities, and it's high fatality rate. Now, what processors do get the choice of is that they can look for either Listeria monocytogenes specifically or Listeria species. So there's 13 Listeria species, and again, you look for those indicators that'll give you an indicator of the potential of Listeria mono. If you look for Listeria monocytogenes specifically, likelihood you won't find it, because it's like needles in haystacks. But Listeria species, even though not pathogenic, they share the common physiology. So if you've got a Listeria species there, probability you've got Listeria mono. Now, when I get contacted, I seem to get contacted by a lot of companies, don't I? But I do get this was one from last year. So essentially what this company had done, and they were producing fresh produce. They performed a routine environmental sample for Listeria on a zone 2. And, it was an electrical control box. Now, they rang me saying, oh, we've got Listeria species positive. What should we do? What did I advise them to do? Did I say recall all the product from when the sample was taken? Did I say put everything you've got on hold, close the facility, or just identify the species of Listeria recovered, or just resample the area and forget about the last result? And these are the kind of decisions you have to make. And if you're in the eye of the storm, these are really critical, because your business is right on the line. All right, well, let's see what people do then. Oh, well, some people, nobody's going to close the facility. That's good, because they did recall the product. That's interesting. Oh, the big one was place all the product on hold. So what you would typically do is first of all, you only act on positive results. So if this was a zone 1, as in a food contact surface, you would go with A and B, for definite. You would hold it because you've got something going on. But the thing is, if it's in a zone 2, it's not directly linked to the product itself. And you only act on it if it's a monocytogenes. So in this case, for example, even if it was a monocytogenes, you would go ahead still. But when it's done, it's given you an alarm bell. It's said to you, something's going wrong with the sanitation plan. You've got to get this right. You would increase the frequency of testing, but you wouldn't close the plant down. You wouldn't have a product recall, because the reality is when you go to work in industry, if you can't detect Listeria, you're not trying hard enough. And that's what companies look for, the retailers look for. They don't, if you suddenly get no Listeria, they start saying, oh, your sampling plan's all wrong. It's just the ironic way things happen, isn't it? So that's how you act on the results. So with environmental results, you look more for trend analysis. So you're getting Listeria positives and species, and you've got to try and drive them down. Typically, this is where you would rotate the sanitizer. You would say, well, what we're doing is not good enough. We'll have to keep revising the way we do sanitation. What was interesting with that company is that they only focused on this control box. I tried to tell them, saying, well, no, the control box is just one area. The Listeria came from somewhere else. So you're going to find out where it is. And so you do what we call microbial mapping, where you literally go sampling throughout the line and look for Listeria. And hopefully, with your help of genetic typing, like next generation sequencing, you can get a fingerprint, and thereby you can track and trace the source of contamination. So when you do get a Listeria positive, your first instinct is to get the bleach out and nuke the area. You don't want to do that. You've got to look at it like a crime scene and then take samples and get clues and find where the source came from. Now, in that case, what we found, we did some microbial mapping, is that we found the Listeria coming in on people's shoes. It's that example I might give you. From that point, we could see how obviously people may tie the shoelace up or something, and then that's probably how it got into the control box. And the obvious thing is you put a foot there, but more importantly, you'll get people to change into boots or something. And I don't know if they did that or not, but you never know. You can only ask, isn't it? All right, so we'll quickly go through implementation of the plan. So implementing the plan is really, as the name suggests, you've done all your homework, you've got your sampling plan done, you've got your SSOPs done. So what you're going to do now is really describe how you're going to do sanitation and perform it. And as I mentioned to you in my day, years and years ago, nobody gave you instructions, just said, here's a hose, here's a bucket, here's a brush, get on with it. But it's a very sequential process. And what you've got to do is remove the organics, because the organics interfere with sanitizer performance. And so what you'll find is you do a dry clean first, a shovel and brush. Then you rinse off as much as you can, and then you apply detergent for the fine soils and solids on the surface. Then you sanitize at the end point. And, when you're sanitizing your kitchen or home, I don't think you consciously do this, but, if you want to implement your own sanitation plan at home, this is how you can do it. Now, the thing is that you can get all kinds of issues that are all going on at the same time. So the initial part is to get the soils, because the soils interfere with the sanitizer, and obviously they carry contamination as well. Now, what you have to do here is make sure you've got the proper equipment. And when we say proper equipment, even the brushes, if it's too soft, it won't be enough to remove some of these solids. If it's too stiff, you start getting scratches, and scratches mean biofilms. And the pressure of the spray, I remember when I know I keep recollecting back to the good old days, but they gave us these really high pressure hoses, and we like to fight each other with them, which we shouldn't have done, but we did. But the trouble with these high pressure hoses, they might look effective. It is the ones you use in car wash and whatnot, but they produce aerosols. And these aerosols can be transferred throughout the plant. So you use moderate pressure. And the other problem with pressure is you damage the equipment. Damage, scratches, pits, all mean biofilms and heartache later on. Now, another thing with brushes and things like this is that you can get contamination transferred if someone takes it from a low-risk area, raw materials, to a high-risk area. And there was an outbreak of salmonella with bean sprouts back in 2006. And it was traced to this sprout facility. And what they were doing is that they had this sprout facility next to a poultry processing plant. And they're literally taking brushes and buckets and everything from the poultry plant into the sprout facility. And they wonder why they got salmonella outbreak anyway. So what they normally do these days, if you go into a facility, you'll see different coloured brooms and that. And what that's to do with is making sure that those that are red stay in the red zone, those that are blue, finished product, stay in that zone. Seems obvious, but people do it. So as I mentioned to you, you've got to have dedicated brooms and brushes, and it literally is optimizing things. So you can do all kinds of things. There's glow germ, which is a sort of fluorescent dye, so you can tell, say, is my brush doing anything? Is it not doing anything? All things like that. So once you've cleared all the materials out, you do a pre-rinse to get rid of as many soils as you can. Again, low pressure hose, not high pressure hose, for the reasons I've just given. And as I say, this is where sanitary design really helps, because some places you can't get to, with other places, good sanitary design you can. Now, when it comes to detergents, no, we just think, well, we just use any old detergent, isn't it? But in the industry, it really depends on the type of soils you're going to have. So for a lot of materials, lipids, carbohydrates, general purpose will be fine. So this is just a detergent. You're emulsifying the soils off the surface as you would do. But when you come to high protein, for example, meat facilities, if you use an acid or a general purpose, it won't work. In actual fact, acid will just weld the protein to the surface. So what they have to use is an alkali-based detergent. So alkali solubilizes proteins, and therefore, when you go to a meat facility, you'll often see sort of alkali-based detergents for that. Chlorinated alkanes. So if you're in a low-risk area, like, for example, a receiving area of a slaughterhouse, you could use chlorinated alkynes. So what you do here is that it's in a foam. So not only does it clean, but it can sanitize at the same time. And acids are used for scale, so heat exchangers. And then you get enzymes, lipase and proteases. So you've got soap tanks, you've got clean in place systems, and you've got clean out of place systems, and you've got the old manual buckets. So all these different sort of techniques you can use. I'm going to sneeze in a minute. All these things you can use to actually get rid of those residues. Ooh. So at the end of the time, we've got all rid of your detergents, and you've got to rinse them off for the simple reason. I'm going to sneeze in a minute. I can feel it. I got better. So the thing with detergents, what you have to do is remove them in order to ensure that you don't have any residue to sequester the sanitizer. And so once you've detergent applied, you post-rinse it, and then you add the sanitizer. And some of these sanitizers are what we call no rinse. So no rinse means you can leave a residue on there. So the ones, for example, for that are quaternary ammonium salts and peroxyacetic acid. Now, there's pros and cons to this. The con is that you've got residues, and these residues can get into the product. So there are some recalls where that's happened before, where basically they've put too much of the quat on, put a product over it. It's not totally toxic if you consume it. It won't do you good, but it won't kill you. But that's one reason you get residues in the product. But the other reason why people don't like these sort of residues is that it can build up resistance in the bacteria. So, for example, with quats, that's a non-rinse sanitizer. But if you get sublethal concentrations and you've got listeria population, they actually can become resistant to it. And so, pros and cons. The pros, obviously, is that you've got this other lasting effect. So, with chemical sanitizers, as I mentioned to you, you can't just add a sort of measure and say, well, that's going to be enough. It really is down to contact time and concentration. And just to confuse you, these are called CT times. So we talk about CT, real-time PCR, but we can also talk about CT times in terms of sanitizers. So with sanitizers, it's obvious, well, it might not be obvious, but it's all to do with the lower the concentration, the longer contact time you need to achieve a certain objective, a 5-log reduction, for example. But the higher the concentration, that needs a shorter time, doesn't it? And so what you have to do is decide on the contact time and the concentration. You might be thinking, well, just really load it up. Highest concentration. Let's be like the supermarkets were in the early COVID days where they would put neat sanitizer on your hand. But the problem with that is that a lot of these sanitizers are corrosive and they cause rusting, corrosion, and this corrosion and rusting forms biofilms. So there is those occasions where you would go for a low concentration but longer contact time for that reason. And the thing is, you can't just put, and I guess it's at home we do this, we put the sanitizer on and wipe it off immediately. Sanitizers need time to work. And also the temperature, if you can increase the temperature, it increases the efficacy as well in most sanitizers. So thankfully, and a lot of times, these sanitizer concentration and contact times are being determined by the manufacturer. And we'll talk about the dilution test in a little bit. So, but what you have to do is follow the label, which I think if anyone puts hand on the heart, when they take bleach, for example, and never read the instructions saying 1 teaspoon in a litre, they just give it a good measure, don't they? So, and I say more isn't better because of corrosion and things like that. And with, especially with bleach, like chlorine, hypochlorite, it really is dependent on the pH. So, I've seen a lot of people saying, well, the more chlorine we use, the better it is. But the thing is, chlorine is alkali. That's how it's stabilized. So the more bleach you add, the more alkali it gets. And the thing with chlorine is that it's really only active at pH 7 and below. You don't want to get to pH 4 because that's when the chlorine gas is generated. So with those kind of sanitizers, you have to monitor the pH as well. And as I said, the cleanliness is important because if you've got soils or sanitizers there, they sequester the action of the sanitizer itself. So there's no point in putting bleach on a pile or on a sort of area which has still got solid debris in. Water hardness really does affect quaternary ammonium salts. It neutralizes some. And so sometimes you'll add a chelating agent, EDTA, things like that. And obviously biofilms are a big curse. Once biofilms get there, there's not many sanitizers that can remove them. So the sanitizer, the type of soils, and all these are decision making, but also the microbe itself. And in the age of COVID, as we are, it's quite not funny, but it's quite odd the way people view things. They say, "Oh, we're going to use these really powerful sanitizers to inactivate the COVID." The reality is it's very sensitive. 0.1% hydrogen peroxide can take it out. Even sodium bicarbonate can take it out. These are very sensitive. These are called envelope viruses. and they differ from the non-envelope, which are much more tougher. So one's got a lipid coat, which, as you can imagine, is very sensitive. One's got a protein coat, which is much harder. So you've got to think about your target. Are you looking at viruses? Are you looking for protozoan? Enteric protozoan have these spore-like structures called ois or cysts, and these are not as powerful as endospores. They've got the same sort of resistance, but this is typically how they survive in the environment. They live in a spore form until they get into a host, and then once they get into the host, then they start growing. But endospores are the toughest one. So if we're in hospitals, for example, obviously Clostridium difficile and the sporocidal activity is key. But, as I might have mentioned this in the meat plants as well, especially in meat packing plants where they vacuum pack their product. The psychotrophic Clostridia really a big spoilage problem. So if you do get that, you have to think, what sanitizer do we need in order to inactivate those Clostridia spores? And we've done spores before. So what I'm going to do is give you a revision question if you want. So when we think about spores and chemical resistance, what do you think is the structure in that spore that provides the spore resistance? And why is it so tough? I hope I'm not getting a cold. It's not COVID. All right. So the spore's got different structures, from the spore coat to the cortex to the small acid-soluble protein and the forespore membrane. But which one of those is critical for resistance? All right. So we'll see what responses are. I'm sure you got all this right. Oh, wow. There's a bit of a split one, but the majority are right. Yeah, basically, it's a spore coat, isn't it? The spore coat is impermeable layer, which essentially would protect against ingress of chemicals and things like that. So with spores, they are kind of the hardest structures to do. But what I'm getting at, and I think I'm repeating too much, is you've got to think what your issue is and match the sanitizer to that issue. So in terms of gram-positive, gram-negative, the gram-negatives has this outer cytoplasmic membrane, which again forms this sort of physical barrier. And so what you typically find is that gram-positives are much more sensitive. Now, when it comes to alkali sort of sanitizers like polyphosphates and things like that, the gram-negatives become more sensitive because the gram-negative outer cytoplasmic membrane is removed by alkali conditions. So, there's general terms, though, gram-positives are typically more sensitive. All right, let's see what we've got here. Oh, no, I think we missed a question out there, isn't it? Oh, right, I think I've told you all these answers already, but we'll see who's listening, isn't it? So, as I mentioned to you, different microbes have different sensitivities. So, if you go from the most resistant down, what's the order? What's the order? Is it gram-positives the most, or Staphylococcus is highlighted because Staphylococcus is, I will say, unusual. Let's put it this way: it survives very well on the surface, and it forms these clusters of cells which are resistant to sanitizers. So Staphylococcus, if you want to, it's one of those targets. It's obviously very important in healthcare with MRSA, but even in other facilities, Staphylococcus are the ones that usually stick around, literally, because they form biofilms. So, and things like Pseudomonas aeruginosa and other pseudomonads, again, they form biofilms, so they kind of into that category. But what about envelope virus, gram-negative, enteric protozoa, and endospores? What I should have done is actually put mole spores there as well, because in a lot of instances, it's the mole spores you're trying to control. All right. All right then. So I think. No. I can't see what your responses were. I must have loaded the question wrong. So anyway, the correct answers, isn't it? The endospores are the most resistant. Oh no, hang on, that's it. Oh, there you go. That's it. I was just going to say. So, endospores resistant and staphylococcus, the enteric protozoa, they produce these spores. Oh, dear me. They produce these spores, but they're not as resistant. And if you want, I know, I would imagine mold spores are about the same kind of tolerance to it. Then you've got your gram negatives and then your gram positives and your envelope viruses, like coronavirus being the most sensitive. Now, the problem is as I mentioned to you, when you scrub hard, when you use corrosive chemicals, you get pits, scratches, and these are niches for biofilm formation. And we covered biofilm formation before, haven't we? We get nucleation sites, and then they tend to build up through this exopolysaccharide production. And once they get to a critical mass, they tend to then shed off and produce new biofilms. And they can be mixed biofilms. And the thing with biofilms also is that, as we mentioned numerous times, is that they go into a dormant state, which basically increases their resistance even further. So you've got physical protection, protection from desiccation, genetic exchange. It's a place to be, isn't it? But the thing is, once you get biofilms, it's very hard to remove them. And we talked about clean in place, I think, didn't we? Where people say, oh, it's ideal, isn't it? Because you just press a button, it goes through all these cycles of caustic soda, acid, and sanitizer. But what it lacks is the physical activity, the physical abrasion to remove biofilms. And they're a big issue. So if you want to get rich, if you've got a biofilm buster, it'll be rare. And it's amazing, even today, there's very few options people have. People claim, oh, we get rid of biofilms, but in reality, it's not really true. It doesn't stop marking, does it? Now, the thing is that you've got to, once you've chosen your microbe and things like that, you've got to find out what is the best sanitizer, what is the best contact time, and what is the best concentration. Now, obviously, if it was non-regulated, any company could come to you and say, we get rid of biofilms, we get rid of staph, we get rid of this and that, make big claims. Now, the thing is, though, thankfully, to be registered as a sanitizer, you have to have a performance standard. And that performance standard is what we call a dilution test. Not sure why they call it a dilution test, but that's what they call it. So in a dilution test, what it does is categorize your sanitizer. Is it going to be general? Is it going to be a sporicidal, fungicidal, things like this? And what they do in this test is that you've got to choose the correct microbe to challenge on. So if you're sporicidal, it's obviously Bacillus and Clostridia. If you're looking for hospitals, you're really looking for those ones of relevance to the hospital, Staph aureus, Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And for general ones, you could use a Salmonella and Staphylococcus. Staphylococcus is one of those that I keep mentioning is quite high resistant for the physiology, and it's the way it arranges. So in the dilution test, what you do is you literally get your your test microbe, you load it into a solution at 10 to the 7, you give it 30 seconds contact time, you neutralize it and count survivors. And what you're going to achieve is a 5-log reduction within 30 seconds to get onto the approval list. But it doesn't end there. You've got to show that it works at a certain water hardness, it's not interrupted, a certain organic loading. And also what they have is something called a suspension test, where you inoculate your test microbe into a solution of sanitizer and leave it for a week. If that grows, then you've failed the test. So when a sanitizer company comes knocking on your door, you essentially ask them, saying, where's your dilution test result? At which point they usually start sweating a bit. But that's how you work out what concentration of sanitizer you want, and it's always good to test. Now, I won't go through this too much detail. I think I'll bore you more than I'm doing now. But the choice of sanitizer is key. You've got so many different ones on the market, and the choice is dependent on various factors. One, the microbe, what type of soils you expect, and in other ways, ease of handling sometimes, and historic use and things like that. But ideally, You want one that's broad in terms of activity against virus in the spores, for example. You want it independent of the environment in terms of pH, in terms of type of surface, sensitivity to organics, miscible in water, obviously, because it's chief solvent, isn't it? Inexpensive, as always, but not to irritate. So, for example, peroxyacetic acid is very good, but it really is corrosive and irritating to skin. And you don't want to get taints in there. So what we have then is that we have various sanitizers, the most popular being chlorine, then iodine, ammonium salts, chlorine dioxide. And these have different concentrations of effectiveness. And the reason for that is the effect on the surface itself, but also the risk of residues. You know, because if you get residues tainting your product, it's going to be worse, isn't it? So you'll find those recommended concentration for food contact surface is different from non-food contact surface for that reason. So we'll go through all of these in turn. Chlorine is bleach, and it's inexpensive, historic use. But it's interesting, if you decided to propose chlorine as a disinfectant today, it would probably never get accepted. And the reason for that is that chlorine reacts with amino acids and other things like proteins, produce chloroamines. And these chloroamines are carcinogenic, so it gives a toxic residue. And this is why people go on about campaigning saying, oh, we should remove chlorine from the drinking water. Well, I think if we did that, we'll be back to the days of dysentery, isn't it? It is corrosive, as you probably guessed if you ever used it. pH dependent, only really effective at pH 7. If you go to acidic pH, what some people do, it produces chlorine dioxide. And it's very sensitive to organics. So if you put chlorine into a fresh produce wash, for example, it doesn't survive long. It just gets sequestered. So people like chlorine dioxide is based on mixing chlorite with an acid, and it produces this greenish gas, very irritating if you breathe it in. It's much more powerful, and it's less byproducts for the simple reason it's acidic, and those byproducts don't form under acidic conditions. But on the other hand, you only can use about 20 ppm to 80 ppm, and so kind of limited. And a lot of when we say viruses, we mean the non-envelope viruses. They're quite stable to various sanitizers, and it gets them stable at high temperatures. So what some people choose is ozone. So ozone is it sounds ideal, no residue, it doesn't react to anything. But the thing is, and you've got to produce it on site because it's so unstable. But the trouble with ozone is that once it basically hits the surface, it decomposes. It doesn't have the residual there. So I've seen people use ozone in terms of trying to use it as a sanitizer rather than chlorine, and it's been very ineffective. And it reminds me of a product many years ago now. I can't remember the name, but they launched a domestic ozone unit, and the marketplace people came to me and said, could you test this out? And we tested it. And what it was is basically a bottle, you put an ozone generator, it generates a bit of ozone, you spray it on the surface. And we found that just the act of spraying means that none of the ozone actually reaches the surface. It basically released into the air. But the ironic thing is he made so much money out of that invention because it looked pretty neat in terms of design. But ozone is good for one reason, is that it doesn't generate byproducts, but bad because it's so sensitive. We use ORP, oxidation reduction potential, and just 10 mgs of protein is enough to basically decompose it. Now, if you work in a dairy or fermentation facility, you'll see iodine dip baths. So iodine was one of the first sanitizers used, and Lord Lister, I think it was. And the reason for that is because it's almost ideal. It's stable, free of environmental sort of factors, very effective against viruses. And this is why they use it in fermentation dairy facilities, because it can inactivate the bacteriophage. And its colour gives its activity. But the disadvantage, as you probably guess if you use iodine, it stains like mad. I know someone who's poured a whole bottle, well, not on purpose, but they got a bottle of iodine on themselves, and they had to get rid of all the jackets and that because you could never get the stain out. Well, it's funny to see that, but anyway, so it's not used widely, but it's used for those kind of hand dips and things like that. And it does stain, things like this. Now, there's others that are based on alkaline acid. As I mentioned, trisodium phosphate's used, very effective against gram negatives. Quaternary ammonium salts, as I mentioned, is surfactants, and they're quite effective against gram positives. And when you think about listeria, you think about, and there was just a paper yesterday that says our quaternary ammonium salts are very effective against coronavirus, which is, it's not news, is it? But anyway, that's what it is. And organic acids like peroxyacetic acid, things like that. Again, it's corrosive, but effective. So often you'll come across quaternary ammonium salts and the reason compounds. And the reason for that is because of its activity against gram positives. And it's the fact that it's got a residual activity which has pros and cons. So with peroxy compounds, these are essentially peroxyacetic acid. They say non-corrosive, but it's only non-corrosive because you can only use them at low concentration, at 20 to 480 ppm. They say it's effective against biofilms, but in reality, they're not that much. And then you've got in situ dry heating and steam, which is challenging to apply, but again, no residue. It can damage your equipment. And I've seen whole pieces of equipment taken and been autoclaved, but it's one of those sort of things that people like to see because it can overcome things, but there again, it can make the problem worse by sticking biofilms onto surfaces. And you can get sort of in situ conveyors like this one, which is steam on a conveyor, and it continuously cleans it through processing, or you can illuminate areas of UV. The problem with these kind of devices is that they can accumulate debris, and as you can imagine, if you heat things and you weld them on to surfaces, it can form biofilms and things like that. And UV suffers because of that. Debris just shield what you're looking for. You can increase vancidity. So I know we've got time, but I'm going to finish this. You can listen to the recording later. I'm nearly finished, and I think just for the flow of it all, I'll just cover antimicrobial coatings, which is the big area now, because with antimicrobial coatings, you get this long-lasting effect. The trouble with sanitation is that you can sanitize an area, and 20 minutes into production, it gets contaminated again. So it stands to reason if you have antimicrobial coatings, it'll be a good thing. And early in the pandemic, you might have heard of these coatings. Basically, they're coated onto all these surfaces. And as a concept, it's a good idea, isn't it? You say, well, you've got this long-lasting effect, but in reality, it's very challenging. And the challenging part becomes with stability and longevity. So the ones that we kind of encounter, things like chitosan, which is this cationic polymer. You can get ones that have got triclosan or bacteriocins in, impregnated. And I think if you, a few years ago, I forget what brand it is, but they used to sell triclosan in cutting board, triclosan knives, triclosan everywhere. And you don't see it now. And the reason why you don't see it is because it's an environmental pollutant and it was leaching. You get ones based on titanium dioxide, which are the ones that typically you'll see on the news saying, they sprayed carriages with this. You get other ones which have got sort of iron oxides, which are ROS, which is the reactive oxygen species generators, and you can't sell that. And you get silver and copper. So silver and copper are very popular in terms of antimicrobial coatings, but they're not allowed here in Canada for whatever reason. So in terms of categories, these coatings are based on different parts. So one is physically they repel bacteria, and anti-adhesives, as I call them. And the trouble with anti-adhesives is that they just displace one problem and put it downstream to another problem. So I'm not sure why people rave about them. You get ones which have got grafted biocides in. So these are the things like triclosan, quaternary ammonium salts. basically start leaching out over time. We've got other ones which are bioactive films, and these are kind of the halamine ones. These are the ones where you've immobilized antimicrobials on the surface, like silver, like copper, like halamides and things like this. Then you get ones based on things like iron oxides, which produce these reactive oxygen species, or nitric oxide to kill bacteria. And you get the ones that you shine a light on, titanium dioxide, for example, to produce the free radicals. So these are the kind of different films you get. And one of the most exciting, if you can make these coatings exciting, is the halamines. So the halamines are what we call self-healing films. So one of the big problems with antimicrobial coatings is the fact that they wear out. If you've got impregnated quaternary ammonium salt, it leaches out. If you've got triclosan, it leaches out. Same with quaternary ammonium salt. Well, these self-healing films, what the prospect is that you can regenerate the film again and again. So what it's all based on is these halogens. For example, so you've got a nitrogen group, and you get amine, amide bonds formed. It reacts with the halogen, and in this case, it's chlorine. So what we do is that we have a substrate, for example, polyethylene base, and we do something called layer by layer construction. So layer by layer construction is a bit like building a brick wall. You do it by layer, and then you've got things like polyethylamine, which is this imine, which is PEI. That's polyethylamine, or you can get things like polyacrylic acid, and you layer these on the surface, and then you react them with bleach, hypochlorite, and this produces these halamines, and these halamines are antimicrobial. And this graph here is just about listeria. It just illustrates that when you haven't got these halamines, you get loss of listeria, but when you've got layers of these halamines, you get no listeria. And the reason why they call self-healing is that you can regenerate the film by just reacting with chlorine again. So in a sanitation, you can just wash with chlorine and it regenerates the film. Ideal, isn't it? It sounds like too good to be true. And the reason why that is because it is too good to be true. I think the last I saw, you could regenerate them about 5 times and then they get lost, they lose their activity. And this is the issue with all these antimicrobial coatings I mentioned. There was a big market for silver, for example, silver-coated conveyors. But once the silver's leached out, all you've got is a conveyor, and you have to replace the whole part, which was just too expensive. So choosing the right sanitizer to right after, all based on the type and also the concentration. And sometimes you want to avoid wet sanitizer, aqueous sanitizer altogether, especially in dry ingredients facilities. And we'll finish off in about 5 minutes, just talking about dry cleaning. So if you're in a dry ingredient facility, or a dry product or low moisture food facility, water is the last thing you want. Water causes microbial growth, which gives you issues of contaminated product. So dry cleaning is almost ideal. Now, most places you can't. Like if you said, I'm going to go to Maple Leaf and their deli meat plant, I'm going to do dry cleaning. It's not going to work because you need the detergents and that to remove the soils. But certainly in dry, low moisture foods like nuts facilities, that it's ideal. So you can use hot oil, you can use alcohol, the IPA, isopropyl alcohol. And if you are going to use water, which sometimes you have to, you can remove it to a different room, different part of the plant. You don't use it on site. And you've got all kinds of different ways of doing it. This is a dry air, for example, compressed air. You get vacuums. This is a CO2 generator. All these things just to dislodge without introducing water, which can be a harbour point. And to finish off, I just want to talk to you about a case I was on about 10 years ago now. And this is a dry ingredient facility. It's actually a pet food facility. They produce dog food, kibble, I forget what the word is. And the thing is that they had a supplier of a flavouring agent, and It was in France, and they used to export it. But this supplier burnt down. I think it was an insurance job as well. So they switched suppliers, and then suddenly they started getting salmonella positives in the end product. And the first instance they had was sanitize everything and go to the raw material and see if salmonella's there, which they duly did. And they increased testing, people's old way of doing things, increased testing. And they found no salmonella in the raw material, but they were getting more positives on the end product. So they started increasing the sanitation. They broke the golden rule of don't introduce water. They went wholeheartedly and say, right, we're going to sanitize this place with quartz, bleach, everything like that. And they did that, but they were still getting salmonella. And that's when they called me in. I always get called in at, the time when everything else has failed. I suppose like the A-team or something, maybe not. But anyway, so the first thing you've got to do when you get into a situation like this is you can't destroy the evidence. You're tempted to clean everything, but don't, because you want to do your mapping experiments. So what we did is started doing our microbial mapping. You take different samples at different points, and as we talked about before, you inspect all the different zones, zone 2s, 3s, and zone 1. And what we came across was this old sort of pipe thing, gear, I think it's a gear housing, isn't it? And we saw a microscopic sort of crack in it where, traditionally you wouldn't think of anything, would you? You will say, oh, it's just a little crack, but biofilms formed. And sure enough, we sampled there, and that's where the salmonella was. So, by them essentially increasing sanitation without identifying the root cause, they caused the problem worse and worse. And it's amazing how many companies do that. So we told them to repair it, told them to dry sanitize, and a happy ending. So when you do get faced in industry with finding a positive, the inclination is to sanitize everything or put blame on somebody. It doesn't help. You've got to use it as a crime scene, and then you've got to do your microbial sampling then. And in addition to that, you look at the monitoring record. Has someone used the wrong detergent, wrong sanitizer? Is it out of date? All these things, and then you start eliminating sources through investigative sampling. But as I mentioned to you, the key thing is always to get to the root cause of the issue. Problems don't go well. Some problems go away by themselves, but most of the time you've got to try and detect them. And once you've done that, you've got to do your corrective actions, repair, evaluate, retrain, all these kind of things. All right, so now I've got over time, a lot. But we can start our sort of food processing. So with Unit 8, which we've just finished, we do need to, you do need to write a summary. And I'll try and change the dates. It's the 18th now, so I'll give it a week, and then we should be all right. Okay.